The auction block creaked beneath her feet like a gallows platform. Mabel stood silent, eyes fixed on distant mountains, while her father's voice cut through the marketplace. $5 for the barren woman. 4 years wed, 3 babes lost to the earth, now worth less than a worn saddle at Sunday trade. Sheriff Porter's hand rested uneasily on his belt, watching but not interfering. The drought-cracked town square baked under a merciless sun that scorched all fragile things. When the timberman approached, Silas Harker, 4 motherless children waiting in his wagon, whispers rippled through the gathered crowd. The oldest girl clutched a faded shawl like armor against this unknown woman. "You buyin' a wife or a servant?" someone called. Something flickered in Silas's weather-carved face. Not desire or triumph, but a shadow of remembered pain. "Neither," he answered, extending his hand. "Just offerin' shelter to the storm-tossed. What desperate need drives a man to purchase a woman deemed worthless? What hidden strengths lie beneath Mabel's silent dignity? Drop your thoughts below, mark with a heart if you're already invested, and journey into a tale where the most barren ground often yields the most unexpected bloom." The auction block splintered beneath Mabel's worn boots, familiar after 3 hours of standing, her shadow shrinking as the sun climbed toward noon. The marketplace bustled around her, ordinary commerce of the frontier town continuing while she stood like merchandise, which she was. $5, her father announced again, voice pitched to Carrie. Strong back, good cook, clean habits. $5 for the woman. Mabel kept her gaze on the distant mountains. 4 years of marriage, 3 lost babes, and now worth less than a decent milk cow. Her bundle of possessions sat at her feet, pathetically small, a spare dress, a hairbrush, a faded quilt square. Everything else belonged to the husband who'd returned her to her father upon discovering her barrenness. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably nearby, watching the proceedings with a furrowed brow. Not interfering. Sales of indentured servants weren't uncommon in these parts, but something about this particular transaction troubled his weathered face. "Ain't worth feed nor fabric," her father muttered to a passing farmer who'd slowed to look. "Can't birth nothin' but disappointment." The crowd's reaction varied. Some women whispered behind raised hands. Some men assessed her work-capable body with calculating eyes. Others hurried past with averted gazes. None offered coins. A wagon rumbled to a stop at the edge of the square. Silas Harker, the timberman whose wife had died last winter, climbed down. 4 children of varying ages remained seated, watching with solemn eyes. And the oldest, a girl on the cusp of womanhood, clutched a faded shawl around her shoulders despite the warmth of the day. "You buyin' yourself a housekeeper or a new wife?" called a man lounging against the general store, voice slicing through the dust-thick air. Whispers rippled through the gathered onlookers. Everyone knew Silas had struggled since his wife's passing. The children looked increasingly unkempt at Sunday services, the youngest often fussy without a mother's attention. Silas approached without responding to the taunt, his weathered face revealing nothing as he studied Mabel. Not her body, as others had, but her face, as though searching for something beyond flesh. $5, her father repeated, straightening at the prospect of a buyer. Silas nodded once, reaching into his pocket for coins. The transaction was completed with brutal efficiency, her father counting payment before the final handshake, never meeting her gaze. When Silas finally approached Mabel, she braced herself for rough handling or immediate orders. Instead, he extended his hand, not to grab, but to offer assistance down from the platform. "Neither," he said, answering the earlier question with quiet dignity. "Just offerin' somewhere to belong." The sheriff stepped forward, frowning at the bill of sale. "Silas, you understand the nature of what you're doing here. There's been talk about these arrangements lately. I understand plenty, Silas replied, voice level but firm. Do you need anything else, Sheriff Porter? The lawman hesitated, then stepped back with a slight nod. Mabel gathered her small bundle, heart pounding despite her outward calm. The children in the wagon watched her approach, expressions ranging from curiosity to wariness. The oldest girl's eyes were particularly sharp, assessing Mabel like a potential threat. "Children," Silas said, as he helped Mabel onto the wagon seat. "This is Miss Mabel. She'll be staying with us for a while." The youngest boy, perhaps 4 years old, sucked his thumb and stared openly. The middle children nodded with uncertain politeness. The teenage girl simply tightened her grip on the shawl, her mother's, Mabel guessed, and looked away. As the wagon pulled away from town, Mabel felt gazes following them, some curious, some judgmental, some pitying. The sheriff still stood by the auction block, troubled expression unchanged. Behind him, dust devils swirled through the marketplace like spectral witnesses to her humiliation. Ahead lay Silas Harker's homestead and whatever future awaited her there. Behind, the drought-parched town faded like her past life, both equally barren. The cabin smelled of pine and lingering grief, dust gathering in corners. Emma's small arms couldn't reach. Mabel stood just inside the doorway, assessing the modest 2-room structure with a practiced eye. Signs of a woman's absence were everywhere. Mismatched plates, stacked haphazardly, children's clothing mended with clumsy stitches, swept floor nevertheless showing tracks of multiple small boots. "Children need looking after," Silas said, the most words he'd strung together since leaving town. "Meals need cooking. House needs a woman's touch." His tone wasn't unkind, but practical. This was a business arrangement, despite his unusual words in town. Mabel nodded, already cataloging tasks in order of importance. "I'll start with supper," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "If you'll show me what supplies you have." Emma, the oldest girl, stepped forward. "I can show her, Pa. I know where Ma kept everything." The emphasis on her mother was unmistakable, territory being marked. Mabel followed the girl to the simple shelves along one wall, noting the protective way Emma handled certain items: a blue tin, a cracked pitcher, objects that clearly held significance beyond their function. "Ma always put the plates this way," Emma said, correcting Mabel's arrangement at supper preparation. "Ma never used that much salt," she added later, watching meal preparations with hawk-like vigilance. The younger children were less guarded. Mary, about 8, showed Mabel her doll made from corn husks. The middle boy, David, asked practical questions about where she had come from. And Thomas, the youngest, simply watched her with wide eyes, thumb occasionally finding his mouth when he thought no one was looking. That first meal was a tense affair, Silas eating quickly before excusing himself to check livestock, leaving Mabel alone with 4 children who barely knew how to react to her presence. She filled the silence by asking gentle questions about their routines, their chores, their preferences, information she needed, but also bridges to understanding. When bedtime came, Thomas unexpectedly approached her chair by the fire. "Will you tell me a story?" he asked, cornhusk horse clutched in one small hand. Ma always did before sleep. From the shadows near the bedroom door, Emma watched, shawl clutched around her shoulders despite the warmth from the fire. Mabel hesitated, feeling the weight of the girl's disapproval. "I know some stories," Mabel said carefully. "Would you like one about animals or people?" "Animals," Thomas decided, climbing onto her lap without invitation. The simple trust of a child who hadn't yet learned to judge value by fertility. Mabel began a tale about clever rabbits outwitting wolves, watching Emma from the corner of her eye. The girl remained in the doorway, listening despite herself. By the story's end, the younger children had gathered close, while Emma maintained her distance, present but unwilling to join. Later, after children were abed and Mabel was clearing the last dishes, Emma approached the shelf where her mother's special items were kept. With deliberate movements, she took down a blue-patterned plate, clearly precious from the way she'd guarded it earlier. "This was Ma's favorite," Emma said, voice tight. "Her mother brought it from back east." As Mabel reached to admire it, Emma's grip loosened. The plate fell, shattering against the plank floor with a crack that seemed to echo through the quiet cabin. Not an accident, a message. "Clumsy me," Emma said, eyes challenging despite the slight tremble in her voice. Mabel knelt silently, gathering sharp fragments, years of containment keeping her face composed despite the deliberate cruelty. When she glanced up, Silas stood in the doorway, returned from the barn. His eyes moved from the broken plate to his daughter's defiant posture to Mabel's careful collection of pieces. "Early day tomorrow," he said finally. "Emma, bed." That night, Mabel arranged her bundle in the corner Silas had indicated, listening to unfamiliar creaks of this new shelter. Not yet home, perhaps never home, but somewhere to belong, as Silas had said. She would begin there. Sheriff Porter's visit came 3 days later, his horse kicking up dust in the yard as drought-parched soil crumbled beneath hooves. Mabel watched from the window as Silas met him on the porch, both men removing hats in the formal way of frontier courtesies that masked discomfort. "Some folks in town are asking questions about your arrangement here," Porter said, voice carrying through the open window. "Council members concerned about the nature of indenture papers, particularly for women." Mabel's hands stilled on the dough she was kneading. She hadn't considered legal complications to her situation, had been too focused on surviving day to day, on navigating Emma's hostility and the younger children's growing attachment. "There's no indenture," Silas replied, surprising her. "Miss Mabel is free to leave whenever she chooses. I purchased her freedom, not her service." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "That's not the common understanding of such transactions." "Not my concern what folks understand or don't," Silas said, replacing his hat. "She's here by choice now. She helps with the children. I provide shelter and food. Simple arrangement between consenting adults." Porter glanced toward the window where Mabel stood, catching her eye briefly before she stepped back into shadow. "Mrs. Holloway has taken particular interest in your situation," he added, mentioning the widow who effectively ruled the town's social sphere. "Says it sets an improper example for impressionable minds." "Mrs. Holloway is welcome to come, mind my children herself, if she's so concerned," Silas replied dryly. After the sheriff departed, Mabel confronted Silas as he entered the kitchen. "I didn't know I could leave," she said quietly. Silas looked genuinely surprised. "Wouldn't keep anyone against their will. Thought that was understood." "Nothing is understood when you're sold like livestock," Mabel replied, her first show of bitterness since arriving. Something shifted in Silas's expression, not pity, which she would have hated, but recognition. "You're free to go if you want," he said simply, "or free to stay. Your choice now." The following Sunday, Mabel attended church with the family, feeling Mrs. Holloway's sharp gaze throughout the service. Afterward, during the social gathering, women who had previously chatted with her moved away when she approached, forming tight circles that excluded her. Only the children seemed oblivious to the sudden coldness. "Don't mind them," a voice said beside her. Mabel turned to find a young woman with a kind face offering a cup of coffee. "I'm Hannah Cooper," The schoolteacher. People talk because they've nothing better to do in a town this size. They think I'm his. Mabel couldn't finish the sentence. They think whatever gives them something to gossip about, Hannah replied, though Mrs. Holloway is particularly concerned her unmarried daughter might have had designs on the widower Harker. As they talked, Mabel noticed an elderly indigenous woman at the edge of the gathering, collecting plants from the dried creek bed that ran behind the church. No one else seemed to acknowledge her presence. "That singing bird," Hannah explained, following Mabel's gaze. "Knows more about this land than anyone, but most folks pretend she doesn't exist unless they need a remedy they can't get from the doctor." On the way home, Mabel noticed how much lower the creek had become since last week. Banks cracked and dusty where water had recently flowed. The children's conversation turned to memories of swimming spots now reduced to muddy puddles. "Dry as spring in memory," Silas commented, eyeing the cloudless sky with concern. "If summer's worse, we'll all be feeling it soon enough." That night, Thomas woke screaming from nightmares. Mabel reached him before Silas, gathering the trembling child against her shoulder with instinctive comfort. When she looked up, Emma stood watching from the doorway, her mother's shawl clutched around her shoulders like armor, eyes filled with confused emotions as Thomas clung to Mabel instead of reaching for his sister. The law's breath on their necks, the earth's thirst in their bones, which would claim them first. With the sheriff sniffing around and the creek bed turning to dust, can Mabel hold on to this fragile new life? Share your hunches about what's brewin', drop a heart if you're rootin' for her fight, and stay hitched to this wagon for the moment when drought and betrayal collide harder than thunder on bare rock. The general store's bell jangled as Mabel entered, mental list of supplies organized by necessity. Flour first, then sugar if possible, perhaps a length of fabric for Thomas's outgrown shirts. 6 weeks at the Harker homestead had established routines, smoothed some rough edges. Even Emma had progressed from outright hostility to wary coexistence. Mr. Parsons, normally quick with a greeting, avoided her gaze. "Good morning," Mabel said, approaching the counter. "I need 5 pounds of flour, please." "Can't help you today," he mumbled, suddenly busy rearranging items on shelves. "I have money," Mabel said, confused. Silas had begun providing a small allowance for household needs, recognizing her contribution deserved compensation. "It's not about money." Parsons glanced toward the back room, where voices murmured. "Mrs. Holloway made things clear. Folks who serve her get her business. Folks who serve those she disapproves of don't get her business." "You're refusing to sell me flour?" Mabel kept her voice level, despite the flush creeping up her neck. "I'm sorry, Miss Mabel." He at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Nothing personal, just business." Mabel left empty-handed, stomach churning with humiliation. Outside, Mrs. Holloway and 2 companions watched her exit, exchanging satisfied glances. The older woman's daughter, pretty, unmarried, and clearly aware of both facts, smiled thinly. That afternoon, Mabel walked 3 miles to an outlying farm, trading embroidery work for flour and eggs. The family, new to the area and unaware of town politics, were happy to establish the arrangement for future weeks. By the time she returned, legs aching from the unaccustomed distance, she'd formulated a plan for securing necessities without town merchants. She didn't mention the incident to Silas, not wanting to burden him with additional concerns as drought conditions worsened. The well ran lower each week, and news from town indicated other homesteads were already hauling water from the river 10 miles south. That evening, as she prepared supper, Emma hovered nearby, watching her add herbs to the stew. "Those aren't the right ones," Emma said suddenly. "Which ones?" Mabel asked, looking at the greenery she'd collected from the kitchen garden. For the stew, Ma always used the ones with pointed leaves, not those round ones. Those aren't good for eating. Mabel hesitated. She recognized most common herbs, but some that grew locally were unfamiliar. She'd assumed these were similar to what she knew. "Are you certain?" she asked. Emma nodded firmly. "I helped Ma enough times. Those ones make you sick." Mabel discarded the suspect herbs, using only those Emma identified as safe. The meal proceeded normally, until halfway through, when Thomas suddenly clutched his stomach, face paling. Within minutes, David and Mary showed similar symptoms, and soon all three younger children were violently ill. "What happened?" Silas demanded, helping Mabel tend to the miserable children. "I don't know," she said, frantic with worry. "Could it be bad water?" Emma stood in the doorway, face ashen as she watched her siblings suffer. Her eyes met Mabel's briefly, before skittering away, guilt evident in her expression. "You knew," Mabel said quietly, realization dawning. "You told me the wrong herbs deliberately." Emma's silence was confirmation enough. Silas looked between them, understanding slowly settling on his features. "Emma, is this true?" "I didn't think it would make them so sick," Emma whispered, tears spilling. "I just thought she'd look foolish, not knowing herbs like Ma did." "Your brothers and sister could have been seriously harmed," Silas said, voice tight with controlled anger. "This stops now, Emma. You want to honor your mother? Start by caring for the family she loved, not poisoning them to spite a woman who's shown nothing but kindness." Emma fled to the barn, leaving uncomfortable silence broken only by the children's miserable whimpers. Mabel worked through the night, brewing mint tea to settle stomachs, applying cool cloths to fevered foreheads. By morning, the worst had passed, though the children remained weak. Silas found Emma asleep in the hayloft, tear-streaked and remorseful. The girl apologized stiffly to Mabel, though genuine contrition showed more in her subsequent behavior. A new carefulness around Mabel, watching her interactions with the younger children with less hostility and more consideration. A week later, Mabel was washing clothes at the creek, now reduced to a series of muddy pools, when a man approached on horseback. Recognition hit her like a physical blow. "Cousin Jeremiah," she acknowledged, wringing water from a shirt with trembling hands. "Well now, if it ain't Baron Mabel," he drawled, dismounting, "looking considerably better fed than when your pa sold you off." "What brings you here?" she asked, gathering clothes into her basket, desperate to return to the cabin's safety. "Passing through, heard interesting talk in town. Seems you landed soft with the widower Harker." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Your pa might be interested to know his worthless daughter found herself such a comfortable situation." The threat was clear: information in exchange for payment, either from her father to reclaim her or from Mabel to keep her whereabouts secret. "I have nothing to give you," she said, "and I'm free to stay or leave as I choose now." "That's so?" He looked skeptical. "Well, I'll be in town another day or two before heading back your pa's way. Might be worth a conversation if you change your mind about having nothing to offer." That evening, Mabel sat on the porch, watching dust clouds gather on the horizon. No rain, just another dry wind to further parch the struggling crops. Silas joined her, their evening conversation having become something of a ritual. "Something troubling you beyond the usual?" he asked, noticing her distraction. She considered deflecting, but found herself explaining Jeremiah's visit and implied threat. "Your father has no claim on you now," Silas said firmly. "Sheriff Porter confirmed that when he visited." "It's not the legality that concerns me," Mabel admitted. It's the trouble he could bring. My father is not a man who believes women have the right to choose their own paths." Silas was quiet a moment. "Would you choose to stay, if all choices were truly free?" The question caught her off guard. Would she? 6 weeks ago, she might have dreamed of escape, of somehow making her way to a place where her barrenness didn't define her value. But now— "Yes," she said softly. Despite everything, Emma's resistance, the town's judgment, even the drought, "I would choose to stay." Something in Silas's expression shifted, a tension releasing. "Then we'll handle whatever comes," he said simply. That night, the winds increased, carrying more dust than moisture. Mabel checked the garden before bed, heart sinking at the withered seedlings struggling in the parched soil. Their food stores would last another month at most, without supplements from garden or town. The drought was no longer an inconvenience, but a genuine threat to survival. She was securing the chicken coop when she noticed movement near the garden fence. Approaching cautiously, she discovered evidence of nighttime intruders, footprints and freshly pulled vegetables. Not animals, but humans, desperate enough to raid their struggling garden under cover of darkness. In the morning, Silas examined the damage with a grim expression. "This will get worse before it gets better," he predicted. "Drought makes even decent folks desperate." When Emma came to help with breakfast, her manner was different, less guarded, more attentive. As they worked side by side, she hesitantly offered, "I know where Ma kept seeds for the dry seasons, special ones that need less water." "That would be very helpful," Mabel said carefully, not wanting to spook this fragile new cooperation. Emma led her to a small wooden box hidden beneath floorboards in the main room. "Ma always said to save these for the worst times," she explained, showing Mabel packets labeled in neat handwriting. "They're from her mother's people, who knew how to grow food when water was scarce." It was the longest, most personal conversation they'd shared. Mabel recognized the significance of Emma sharing this maternal legacy. "Your mother was very wise," she said. "I'd be grateful for your help planting these properly." As they worked together in the garden that afternoon, the storm clouds on the horizon mirrored the darkness gathering around them. But which would break first? The dust storm came without warning. One moment Mabel was hanging laundry, squinting at the darkening horizon. The next, she was calling frantically for the children as a towering wall of dirt and debris raced toward the homestead, turning day to unnatural twilight. "Get Thomas and Mary!" she shouted to Emma, who stood frozen at the sight. "David, help me with the animals." Years of taking orders had taught Mabel to give them effectively. Silas was checking fence lines on the property's far side, too distant to reach them in time. They were on their own. The children scrambled to obey as the wind strengthened, tearing sheets from the line and whipping Mabel's skirts around her legs. She grabbed rope from the barn, working with frantic efficiency. "Tie this around your waist," she instructed, securing one end around David's middle. Then to Emma, then to Mary and Thomas. "I'll lead. We stay together, no matter what." The roar grew deafening as the dust wall approached. Animals panicked in the barn, chickens fluttering in terror, the milk cow bellowing. Mabel tied the other end of the rope around her own waist, then grabbed the cow's halter. "Into the barn, quickly. Cover your faces with wet cloth." They barely made it inside before the storm engulfed them. Darkness descended, absolute and suffocating. The world reduced to touch and sound. The tug of rope at her waist, the terrified breathing of children, the maddened shifting of animals around them. Dust infiltrated everything: nostrils, eyes, the spaces between fingers. Breathing became conscious labor. each inhale carrying grit that scraped the throat raw. The barn groaned around them, timbers protesting as wind-battered walls never meant to withstand such assault. A tremendous crack split the air. The roof, Mabel realized in horror, part of the structure giving way. "Move to the corner!" she shouted, voice barely audible above the storm's fury. She pulled the rope, guiding the children blindly through darkness thick as wool, one hand still gripping the cow's halter. The animal balked, eyes rolling white in the gloom. "David, take your brother and sisters to the root cellar." Decision made instantly. "I'll secure the animals." "I'm staying with you." Emma's voice surprisingly close. "No! They need you!" Another crack, louder this time. Something heavy crashed nearby, startling the cow into motion. Mabel felt the halter tear from her grasp as the animal bolted, knocking her sideways into a support beam. Pain exploded across her ribs. Then Emma was there, hands finding Mabel in the darkness. "You're hurt!" "Get to the cellar," Mabel gasped, fighting for breath in the dust-choked air. Together, they stumbled toward the root cellar entrance, using the rope to guide them. The younger children were already huddled inside, faces pressed into damp cloths Mabel had insisted they bring. Emma helped Mabel down the steep steps, closing the heavy door behind them. In the lantern's feeble glow, 4 dust-covered faces stared at Mabel with expressions ranging from terror to, surprisingly, trust. Even as blood trickled from a cut on her forehead and her ribs throbbed with each breath, something warmed inside her at the realization. They looked to her, not just for direction, but for reassurance, for comfort. They were her children now, in every way that mattered. Hours passed in the close confines of the cellar, the storm's fury gradually subsiding to occasional gusts that rattled the door. The children dozed fitfully, huddled together on old grain sacks. Mabel fought to stay awake despite pain and exhaustion, keeping watch as any mother would. "I did something terrible." Emma's whisper startled Mabel from semi-consciousness. The girl sat beside her, knees drawn to chest, face streaked with dirt and dried tears. "The herbs?" Mabel asked softly. "That's behind us now?" Emma shook her head. "Worse, the seeds, the special ones we planted." Her voice caught. I switched some of them for regular ones that won't grow in drought." Mabel stared at her, comprehension dawning slowly. "Why?" "I wanted you to fail." The confession emerged broken, shameful. "To prove you weren't as good as Ma. But then," she gestured helplessly toward her sleeping siblings, "seeing you today, how you protected them without even thinking about yourself. Ma would have done the same." The admission hung between them, weightier than the dust still swirling outside. "We can replant," Mabel said finally, "if there are more special seeds." "There aren't," Emma whispered. "I ruined the rest." Understanding settled like stone in Mabel's stomach. Without drought-resistant crops, their chances of self-sufficiency through the dry season plummeted. The sabotage wasn't just spiteful, it was potentially deadly. "I didn't think," Emma continued, voice thick with remorse. "I didn't think about how bad the drought might get, or that people would start raiding gardens, or that the store would refuse to sell to us. I just wanted to protect your mother's place." Mabel finished gently. "I understand, Emma, more than you know." When the storm finally passed and they emerged from the cellar, the world had transformed. Drifts of dust covered everything: garden beds, chicken coop, porch steps. Like dirty snow, the barn roof had partially collapsed, though miraculously the animals had survived, huddled in the undamaged corner where Mabel had initially directed the children. Silas returned an hour later, covered in dust and frantic with worry. His relief at finding them alive quickly gave way to dismay as he surveyed the damage. "Crops are gone," he reported grimly. "Buried or torn out, most of the fence down on the east side." "Silas," Mabel said quietly, drawing him aside. She explained Emma's confession about the seeds, watching his expression shift from confusion to understanding to concern. "Without those special seeds or town supplies," he began. "I know," Mabel said, "but blaming won't grow food. We need solutions." That evening, as they picked through the remains of their garden, salvaging what little could be saved, Emma worked silently alongside Mabel, accepting direction without complaint or correction for the first time. The girl's remorse manifested in diligent effort, as though physical labor might atone for her actions. "What will we do?" Emma asked finally, voice small against the vastness of their predicament. Mabel straightened, pressing a hand to her bruised ribs, surveying the devastated landscape. The question wasn't just about replanting or finding new seeds. It encompassed everything: the town's rejection, the dwindling supplies, the relentless drought, the unknown future stretching before them. "We adapt," she answered simply. "We find another way." Later, as Mabel applied salve to cuts and scrapes, Silas sat beside her on the porch, watching the children sort through damaged possessions in the yard. "You handled it well today," he said quietly. "The storm, the children. Anyone would have done the same." "No," he contradicted gently. "Not anyone." A pause. "Sarah, my wife, would have approved of your quick thinking." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife by name to Mabel, a small but significant barrier crossed. Thomas approached then, clutching his cornhusk horse, now missing a leg. "Can you fix him?" he asked Mabel, lower lip trembling. As she took the simple toy, promising repairs, she caught Emma watching from across the yard. Something had shifted in the girl's gaze. The hostility replaced by something more complex. Not quite acceptance, not yet trust, but perhaps the beginning of respect. That night they took inventory of their situation. Garden destroyed, seed stock sabotaged, town supplies inaccessible, water levels critically low, and storm damage requiring immediate attention. The list of calamities should have felt overwhelming, yet somehow Mabel found herself oddly calm. She had survived being discarded by her husband, sold by her father, ostracized by society. This was just another storm to weather. As the children finally slept, exhausted from the day's terrors, Silas and Mabel sat at the kitchen table by lantern light, planning their next steps. "Emma told me something today," Mabel said carefully. "She mentioned her mother's family had knowledge about growing food in drought conditions. Do you know anything about that?" Silas looked surprised. Sarah's mother came from back east, but her grandmother, there were stories about Indian blood. Nothing Sarah talked about much, wasn't something folks advertised. That elderly woman from town, Singing Bird. And the schoolteacher said she knows more about this land than anyone. Mabel hesitated. Perhaps she might have similar knowledge about drought-resistant planting. "Folks don't mix with her kind much," Silas said, but without conviction, though desperate times. "If she can help us feed the children, does it matter what folks think?" Mabel asked quietly. "They've already decided what I am. What more can they say?" The storm had passed, but the worst drought in memory remained, and now without seeds for the future. The town council's decision came as no surprise, yet the blow landed hard nonetheless. Sheriff Porter delivered the news himself, uncomfortable but resolute, as he stood on their porch a week after the dust storm. "Water access is being restricted," he explained, refusing Mabel's offer of coffee. Each household allocated specific times at the town well based on number of residents and, he hesitated, standing in the community. "And where does our household fall in this ranking?" Silas asked, though they all knew the answer. "I'm sorry, Silas. You've been placed last. 1 hour, once weekly, starting next Tuesday." Mabel's hands tightened on her apron. 1 hour weekly wouldn't provide nearly enough for 6 people, especially with their own well running dangerously low. "This is Mrs. Holloway's doing," Silas said, voice tight with controlled anger. Porter didn't deny it. Council voted. I'm just delivering the message. After he left, Silas paced the porch like a caged animal. "This isn't about water. It's about forcing you out, forcing us to conform to their notion of proper arrangements." "Perhaps I should leave," Mabel suggested quietly. "The children would receive better treatment." "No." His response came swift and certain. "That's giving them exactly what they want. Besides, the children need you." The confession hung unspoken between them. He needed her, too. That evening, as Mabel mended clothes by lamplight, Emma approached hesitantly, something clutched against her chest. "Can I show you something?" the girl asked, voice barely above a whisper. She placed a small leather-bound book in Mabel's lap. A journal, pages yellowed with age, filled with delicate handwriting. "It was Ma's," Emma explained, settling beside Mabel on the bench. "I've been reading it since she died." Mabel carefully opened the cover, recognizing the enormity of this trust. The first page bore a simple inscription: "Sarah Harker, Thoughts and Memories." "I've never shown Pa," Emma confessed. "It felt too private, like something just between Ma and me." "Are you sure you want me to read it?" Mabel asked, understanding the profound significance of this offering. Emma nodded. "There's a part about the babies." She turned pages with familiar ease, finding a section dated 4 years earlier. Mabel began to read in the flickering lamplight. "Little Hannah returned to God today. My 4th difficult birth, my 2nd child lost. The midwife says I should bear no more, that my body wasn't made for easy childbearing. Silas tries to hide his grief behind work, but I see how each loss carves him deeper. He says 4 living children is blessing enough, but I know he dreamed of a large family. If these words are read after I'm gone, know this: there is no greater pain than failing to bring forth life you've carried, no greater shame than watching others succeed where you cannot." Mabel's hands trembled as she read words that could have been torn from her own heart. This woman, whose memory Emma had wielded as a weapon against her, had understood the very pain that had defined Mabel's worth to the world. "Keep reading," Emma urged softly. The next entry made Mabel's breath catch. "Dr. Mills says this 5th pregnancy will likely be my last, regardless of outcome. The risk is too great to attempt another. I pray daily for strength to accept God's will, whatever it may be. I've begun preparing Emma for greater responsibilities, though she's only 10. If something happens to me, she'll need to be mother to the little ones until Silas finds someone new." "Until he finds someone new," Mabel repeated, looking at Emma with dawning understanding. "There's more," Emma whispered, turning several pages forward to an entry dated just weeks before Sarah's death. The handwriting was shakier here, the words crammed together as though racing against time. "If you are reading this, I am gone. To my dear children, know you were loved completely. To Silas, find happiness again. Don't waste years in grief that could be spent in joy. Our children deserve a mother's love, even if it comes from another's heart. And to the woman who might take my place someday, thank you for loving what I had to leave behind. Care for them as your own, for in choosing to mother a child not born to you, there is a special kind of strength. Emma will resist you the hardest because she loved me the most. Be patient with her." Tears spilled down Mabel's cheeks, dropping onto the yellowed pages. Beside her, Emma was crying too, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "She knew," Emma managed between tears. "She knew she was dying, and she was thinking about who would take care of us after." "She sounds like an extraordinary woman," Mabel said gently. She was. Emma wiped her eyes. "And I've been so awful to you, when all you've done is exactly what she wanted someone to do." "You were protecting her memory," Mabel said. "That's what loving daughters do." "No, I was being selfish." Emma's admission came with newfound maturity. "Making everything about my pain instead of what the little ones needed." "What Pa needed." They sat together in the lamplight, two women connected by words from beyond, as the drought-stricken wind rattled the windows outside. When Silas found them later, they were still there, heads bent together over Sarah's journal, tears tracking clean lines through the dust that seemed to settle on everything these days. The next morning brought new crisis. Thomas, the youngest, collapsed while carrying a small bucket of precious water from their dwindling well. His lips were cracked, his skin hot and dry to the touch. Dehydration, Mabel diagnosed, having seen similar cases in her previous community. He needs more water than we've been allowing. "We're already rationing to dangerous levels," Silas said, face grim as he carried his son inside. "If we give him more, someone else gets less." The implications hung heavy in the air. They were approaching the point where survival calculations became brutally simple. That afternoon, Silas went to town, determined to appeal the council's decision directly. He returned hours later, defeated and furious. "They wouldn't even hear me out," he reported, slamming his hat against his thigh. "Mrs. Holloway had the gall to suggest that if we found our situation untenable, perhaps certain arrangements should be reconsidered." "She means me," Mabel said quietly. "She can go to hell," Silas replied, with uncharacteristic vehemence. "We'll find another way." But as Thomas's condition worsened and their water barrel scraped bottom, desperation mounted. The other children grew listless in the heat, their small bodies conserving energy as instinct took over. Emma, transformed by her revelation, took charge of carefully measuring water rations, ensuring the youngest received priority. "What about the creek?" Mabel suggested. "Even if it's mostly dry, we could dig deeper, find what's beneath." "Everyone for miles is doing the same," Silas answered. "What little remains is guarded or fouled." That night, as Thomas whimpered in fevered sleep, Mabel made her decision. She waited until the household slept before slipping out, a small offering bundle clutched in her hands, embroidered handkerchiefs, her most valuable possession from her previous life. She knew where to find Singing Bird. The schoolteacher had mentioned the elderly woman lived in a small cabin beyond the dried creek bed on land no one else wanted. By moonlight, Mabel picked her way through familiar territory, now transformed by drought, each landmark altered by absence of water and vegetation. The old woman was waiting on her porch, as though she'd expected a visitor. "I need help," Mabel said simply. "The children need water, and knowledge to grow food when there isn't enough rain." Singing Bird studied her for a long moment, dark eyes unreadable in the moonlight. "Why should I help your people?" she asked finally. "Your people take without asking, then forget who gave. Why help now?" Mabel set her bundle aside, squaring her shoulders despite exhaustion. "I'm not asking for myself," she said. "I'm asking for children who had no part in what came before. And I don't come empty-handed. I bring respect, willingness to learn, and these." She gestured to the embroidered pieces. "Not enough, I know, but I have nothing else to offer except honest work and gratitude." Singing Bird remained silent, but her gaze shifted to something beyond Mabel, triggering an instinctive turn to look behind her. There stood Emma, who had followed despite Mabel's care to leave unnoticed. "The smallest one is very sick," Emma said directly to Singing Bird. "Please." With hearts finally mended, but bodies still thirsting, they would need wisdom beyond the town's ways to survive. With hearts finally mended, but thirsts burning fierce as desert sun, will ancient wisdom save what proper societies condemned. Speak your piece on what's comin', mark your trail with a heart, if you're holding your breath alongside them, and keep your canteen full, for when frontier wisdom clashes with town pride, in a blaze that'll change everything. Dawn found Mabel kneeling in dust beside Singing Bird, learning to recognize underground water sources by subtle signs invisible to untrained eyes. "Land speaks if you listen," the elderly woman explained, placing Mabel's hand on a particular patch of soil. "Feel cooler here. Water runs beneath, even when surface dry." After their midnight encounter, Singing Bird had returned with them to examine Thomas, administering a bitter tea that broke his fever by morning. Her payment, Mabel and Emma's labor and attention as she taught them knowledge passed through generations. "Dig here," she instructed, indicating a spot near the property boundary where certain struggling weeds still clung to life. "Not deep hole, but wide basin. When rain comes, it will gather and sink slow, not run away." They worked through early morning, Emma surprisingly diligent alongside Mabel, both listening intently to instructions that defied everything settlers practiced. No straight rows, but circular plantings. No single crops, but companions that supported each other. No deep plowing, but gentle disturbance that preserved soil moisture. Silas watched from the porch. Thomas recovered enough to sit beside him, sipping the medicinal tea. His expression registered initial skepticism, gradually giving way to thoughtful consideration, as Singing Bird explained principles behind her methods. "Your wife's mother," she said unexpectedly, glancing at Silas. "She had our blood. I remember her." Silas straightened. "You knew Sarah's grandmother?" "Helped your wife birth first child," Singing Bird continued, ignoring his question. "Called for me when doctor gave up. Never saw me after." Whites forget who helps when trouble passes. The revelation created momentary stillness, a bridge forming between past and present. Emma looked between Singing Bird and her father, absorbing this unknown connection to her mother's history. By midday, the transformation had begun. Shallow basins dug to catch future rain, specific areas cleared for drought-resistant seeds. Singing Bird provided from her own stores, stone pathways arranged to direct precious moisture toward plant roots rather than allowing evaporation. "Town folk will talk," Singing Bird warned as they worked. "Say you gone Indian, playing with dirt, wrong way." "Town folk already talk," Mabel replied, wiping sweat from her brow. "At least this way we might eat." The prediction proved accurate. Within days, rumors spread about strange farming practices at the Harker homestead. Children from town, sent to investigate by curious parents, reported back about playing Indian and heathen circles. Several families who had maintained cordial relations despite Mrs. Holloway's influence now withdrew completely. The social isolation intensified, but with it came unexpected freedom. Released from concern about town approval, Mabel embraced Singing Bird's knowledge wholeheartedly. The elderly woman became a regular visitor, teaching not just planting techniques, but medicinal uses of plants still surviving the drought, methods of water conservation, ways to preserve what little food they harvested. Emma proved an apt pupil, her memory for details surpassing even Mabel's. The girl recorded everything in a journal of her own, creating a written legacy of knowledge typically passed through oral tradition. Singing Bird watched this with amused tolerance, occasionally commenting, "Paper burns, memory remains." 2 weeks after implementing the new methods, the first green shoots appeared in their circular garden beds, fragile but determined, pushing through soil everyone else had declared barren for the season. Mabel knelt beside these tiny manifestations of hope, touching one delicate leaf with gentle fingers. "It's working," Emma said softly, kneeling beside her. "It's beginning," Mabel corrected. "We have a long way yet." That evening, as they shared a simple meal stretched to feed 6, plus their occasional guest, Silas spoke what they'd all been thinking. If the town discovers these methods work when theirs fail, they will first mock, then steal, Singing Bird finished matter-of-factly. "White way." "Then we protect what we've learned," Mabel said. "Share with those who ask respectfully, guard against those who would take without understanding." The green shoots were just breaking through when the horizon darkened, not with dust this time, but with smoke. Flames crested the western ridge like a ravenous beast, devouring the drought-parched forest with terrifying speed. Mabel spotted the smoke while hanging laundry, her shout bringing Silas and the children running. "Town's in its path," Silas said grimly, studying the fire's trajectory. "Wind's driving it straight toward the settlement." Within minutes, Sheriff Porter arrived, face streaked with soot. "Every able hand needed," he gasped. "Fires jumped the creek bed, nothing to stop it before town." They didn't hesitate. Even Emma and David were old enough to carry water. Only Thomas remained behind, with strict instructions to stay in the root cellar if the wind shifted. In town, chaos reigned. Men formed bucket lines from the well, women gathered possessions for evacuation, children cried in confusion. The fire's roar grew deafening as it consumed tinder-dry vegetation at the town's edge. Mabel found herself beside Mrs. Holloway, whose fine home stood directly in the fire's path. "My grandmother's things are still inside," the older woman cried, clutching Mabel's arm in desperation. Without hesitation, Mabel turned to the men struggling with uncoordinated efforts. "Dig circles," she shouted over the din. "Not straight lines, circles, like we did at home." Singing Bird appeared at her side, nodding approval. "Fire jumps lines. Circles confuse it." Incredibly, people listened. Perhaps because no other plan existed. Perhaps because desperation overcomes prejudice. Under Mabel and Singing Bird's direction, they created concentric rings of cleared earth around the most vulnerable structures. When flames reached the first circle, they behaved exactly as Singing Bird had predicted, leaping across narrow fire breaks, but becoming disoriented by the circular pattern, unable to find straight paths through the defensive rings. Hours later, exhausted and smoke-stained, they surveyed their work. Half the town saved, including Mrs. Holloway's home. The other half damaged, but not destroyed, recoverable, with community effort. When the last ember died, something else had changed. Eyes that once turned away now met with respect. The rain came 3 days after the fire, gentle at first, then strengthening to a steady downpour that lasted through the night. Mabel stood in the yard, face upturned to the blessed moisture, watching as parched earth drank thirstily after months of deprivation. The children danced in puddles, their laughter a counterpoint to the rain's rhythm on the roof. Even Silas smiled, really smiled, for the first time since Mabel had known him. In town, The mood had shifted as dramatically as the weather. The circular fire breaks had saved homes and businesses that conventional methods would have lost. Mrs. Holloway herself had appeared at their door the previous day, stiff with pride, but nevertheless bearing a length of fabric. For the children's clothes, they'll be needing new things for school. More significantly, the town council had revised water allocation, placing the Harker family in the middle of the schedule rather than at the end. Not equality, but progress. As Mabel watched the rain transform their homestead, Emma approached, something clutched in her hands, her mother's shawl, carefully preserved these many months. "It gets cold in the rain," Emma said simply, draping it around Mabel's shoulders. "Ma would want you to have this now." That evening, with the children asleep and the blessed sound of rain still pattering on the roof, Silas joined Mabel on the porch, sitting closer than usual. "I've been thinking," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant, "about making our arrangement more permanent, if you were willing." Mabel looked at him in the soft darkness. "Are you asking me to marry you, Silas Harker?" "Reckon I am," he admitted, "though it's not much I'm offering. Struggling homestead, 4 half-wild children, man who doesn't always find the right words." "It's everything," Mabel said simply. In the garden, their circular plantings flourished in the rain, proof that even the most barren ground could bloom with proper tending. Inside, 4 children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that the woman who had come to them through the strangest of circumstances had chosen to stay, had fought for them when the earth itself seemed to turn against them. "Yes," Mabel said, reaching for Silas's weathered hand. "I would choose this. I do choose this." What once seemed barren had found its season to bloom. "Folks, this yarn's been burnin' in my bones like wildfire." And truth is, ain't nothing tests a soul like being deemed worthless by your own kin, than having to prove your value in foreign soil. Some might call this just a frontier tale of drought and survival, but I reckon it's more about the parched places inside us all. What struck me hardest was how this land treats women, measured by their wombs rather than their worth, traded like cattle when they don't produce. Yet Mabel showed that true fertility ain't just about bearing children. It's about nurturing life wherever you find it, whether in a stranger's offspring or in dust-choked earth that everyone else has given up on. I kept thinking about how frontier folk survived by adapting. Sometimes that meant learning from people they'd been taught to mistrust, like Singin' Bird with her ancient knowledge. Pride's a luxury when survival's on the line. The ones who made it weren't always the strongest, but the ones willing to bend without breaking. Maybe that's why Emma's journey cut so deep. Holding tight to the past can poison your future sure as bad water. Sometimes the greatest act of loyalty to those we've lost is to keep living fully, to allow joy back into spaces grief has hollowed out. Most of all, this tale reminded me that family ain't always about shared blood. Sometimes it's about shared struggle, about choosing each other when the dust storms blow and the wells run dry. In the harshest territories, we learn who truly stands beside us. I wonder which character spoke to your heart. Was it Mabel with her quiet strength, Emma wrestling with her ghosts, Silas finding his voice again, or maybe Singin' Bird with her wisdom from the margins? Did you see yourself in their struggles or their triumphs? Drop your thoughts below. Mark this tale with a heart if it stirred something in you, and follow along for more stories from the frontier edges where people find themselves tested beyond measure. Much obliged for riding alongside me through drought and fire to witness barren ground finally bloom.